Hello everyone, it's Livia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm going to finally get around to doing the necklace video for the anthology. I'll make a quick apology at the beginning of this video. If my voice suddenly dies, it's because I'm not feeling well, so my voice feels like any second that it's going to break, but I wanted to try and get this video done. So I'll try my best to get through it because it's the last text I have to do from the fiction anthology. So this story is written by Guy de Maupassant, how do you pronounce his surname? He's a French writer, and this is his short story that was translated from French. Some of the themes that this writer used to explore were the countryside, daily life, pessimism, despair, madness, and death. He was born in 1850 and passed away in 1893, and he's famous for his short stories. The necklace is set in 19th century Paris, so we're dealing with the 1800s, which is the Victorian era. And it focuses on Parisian society and obviously the very sort of strict social classes that they had. And the story is about Monsieur and Madame Lucelle, and they're not poor, but they're also not wealthy. So I would argue that they're potentially middle class or emerging, just starting to break into the middle class sector, because the Victorian era is sort of the first period of history where we start to see an emergence of the middle class and people wanting desperately to better themselves, which was still a very sort of tense and angry topic, because the wealthy aristocratic families who obviously have all their bloodline and all their legacy and have had like wealth in their family for generation upon generation, they don't like the middle class. They don't like how the middle class are marrying into their society, and they don't like how the middle class are starting to emerge and try to better themselves because they're old money, and they don't appreciate the emergence of new money, which would be Madame and Monsieur Lucelle, but obviously they're not even starting to break the area of wealth, and they're in the story they're dependent on the little money Monsieur Lucelle earns from his minor job with the government. I think later on in the story we find out he works for the he's a clerk for the like Department of Education that they have, which is surprising that they even have that, but obviously in the Victorian era you're starting to get all these new reforms in to try and help the poorer classes, although it's still very prejudiced against them. But they're starting to try to allow children to receive some form of education. I personally don't know much about Paris around this time, but I know in England, I can't remember the exact date, but in England they started to have all the like poor school bills through, and they would try to get the poorer children into some form of education, like the rag schools they used to call them, which were schools that were specifically designed for the poor, but obviously it focused more on like making sure they didn't become morally corrupt and made sure that they received a religious education and all that sort of prejudice stuff. So I just need to get the photos up. If my phone will cooperate, that would be wonderful. This is like a really long short story, by the way, so I apologise, it's going to be a really long video. I'm going to go through each paragraph. I've made notes pretty much on everything, but towards the end I decided that I'd stop doing that and I'll just read the rest of the short story to you and then just sort of give some ideas on thoughts and perspectives. Okay, so this is the first bit. She was one of those pretty, delightful girls who, apparently by some error of fate, get themselves born the daughters of very minor civil servants. She had no dowry, no expectations, no means of meeting some rich, important man who would understand, love, and marry her, so she went along with a proposal made by a junior clerk in the Ministry of Education. So already we're starting to get this sense of this theme of like being forced by fate. Madame Liesel feels like it implies that she feels she's worthy of better things, and we're already getting the themes of a lack of autonomy for women, and the idea of unrequited love. She's just settled on this proposal. She's not marrying for love, and back then people didn't really marry for love. They married to better their circumstances. But obviously where she's not from, she has good breeding in her mind. She has like the manners and the kind of qualities that a lady of the upper classes would possess, but because of where she was born, she's kind of trapped in her situation. Like, she doesn't move around upper class circles, which means she can't gain access to gaining a wealthy husband, so she's had to settle on a proposal made by a junior clerk. And we can already start to detect it's a very sort of bitter tone to the narration, especially with the listing all the things that she has, like, no dowry, so her father doesn't have enough money to, like, give her a dowry to encourage a husband to take her on, and a dowry was like a set of money or gifts that usually money, but it could also come in the form of jewels or other things, but it was usually a certain amount of money that when the husband marries his wife, he would then gain that financial possession. That was kind of like, well, that's been throughout history. So she doesn't have a dowry, she doesn't have any expectations, and she's basically trapped in her situation. She dressed simply, being unable to afford anything better, but she was every whit as unhappy as any daughter of good family who has come down in the world. Women have neither rank nor class, and their beauty, grace, and charm do service for birthright and connections. Natural guile, instinctive elegance, and adaptability are what determines their place in the hierarchy, and a girl of no birth to speak of may easily be the equal of any society lady. So this is kind of like reversing in structure. This is reversing the previous paragraph. It's sort of making the point that she's basically, she has these high expectations for herself. She knows she's worthy, or she believes she's worthy of more, and she's acting above her station, which was quite a sort of vulgar thing for a young lady to do. She's acting as if she's come from a wealthy family and she's moved down in the world, whereas actually she's probably really fortunate and lucky to have gained a husband at all without a dowry, because I mean, that was a big, marriages were basically business transactions. So we can gain the sense that her potential husband, although we haven't even met him yet, he's probably a really compassionate man. He doesn't care that she doesn't have a dowry. He's married her and proposed to her from a more emotional place, which is really interesting, because in these historical texts you don't always get to see the emotional side of men, because obviously gender expectations were that men weren't meant to feel emotion. They were the breadwinners, they were the ones who went out and earned the money, and they weren't expected to display their emotions, although obviously we all know that men would have had emotions back then. It's just they would have to be really careful who they showed that side to. And it's sort of making the point that she has this view that even though her birth circumstances are beyond her control and she's not been born into the social circle she wanted, she's equal to an upper class lady, which anyone in the upper class circle would meet her, they would probably laugh at, because she's not. But she has this view that she has all the qualities and instincts that would allow her to succeed in that circle if only she can be given a chance to break into it. And like I've mentioned in my notes, it's a very radical idea, because basically she is dreaming about marrying above her station. And like I said at the beginning of this video, that was a very sort of contentious issue for the old money families at the time, because although times were changing, it was still this idea that your bloodline and your family legacy, old money, was superior to new money, because new money just marries into it, whereas you have history and family legacy throughout if you've just been born into wealth. So that's kind of what's happening there. She was unhappy all the time, for she felt that she was intended for a life of refinement and luxury. She was made unhappy by the run-down apartment they lived in, the peeling walls, the battered chairs, and the ugly curtains. Now all this, which any other woman of her station might never even have noticed, was torture to her and made her very angry. The spectacle of the young Breton peasant girl who did the household chores stirred sad regrets and impossible fancies. She dreamed of silent antechambers hung with oriental tapestries, lit by tall bronze candelabras, and of 2 tall footmen in liveried breeches. So that would be a uniform that they would be given by their masters. It's like it could also like contain colours of crest, and it was basically like someone in liveried breeches. It's a uniform given to servants to attach you to that family. asleep in the huge armchairs, dozing in the heavy heat of a stove. She dreamed of great drawing rooms dressed with old silk, filled with fine furniture which showed off trinkets beyond price, and of pretty little parlours, filled with perfumes, and just made for intimate talk at 5 in the afternoon with one's closest friends, who would be the most famous and sought-after men of the day, whose attentions were much coveted and desired by all women. So this repetition of unhappy is really driving home this bitter tone. It shows she's not content with her situation, and this is where we start to see the sort of aesthetics and superficial nature of this of Madame Louiselle. It's very it's like the list of all this like material wealth. There's no emotion to it, but she's very emotive when it comes to daydreaming up all these, like, it's all superficial because it's just material stuff. It's not anything of emotional value, but yet she's attaching emotion to it, which is really interesting. And it also highlights her lack of understanding of this world that she's dreaming of, because the fact that she believes or envisions her 2 tall footmen, wealthy upper class families would not have just had 2 tall footmen. They would have had 30 footmen. They would have had millions of, well, not millions, but they would have had like up in the hundreds of servants serving their house because they live in gigantic manors. And the fact that she envisions them, these 2 tall footmen, like asleep in huge armchairs by the fire, like, you wouldn't even mix with your servants. You would ring the bell, they would come up to you, but you wouldn't actually see the downstairs. You would remain upstairs. So it's really interesting how it's highlighting her lack of understanding of the way this world, she dreams so much about it, and yet she knows nothing about it. She has a very sort of idealistic view of manor living, and it shows through the unrealistic elements of that. And the fact that she already has a little servant she has a servant shows that she's middle class, because a working class family would have no one. They would have to do all the chores themselves. So she's very ungrateful. And it's kind of like how she has a lot of animosity towards her servant girl, because she takes a look at her and says, like, oh, I should have more. And it's like, you really shouldn't. You don't deserve it. But there you go. Okay, that's the first bit. Okay. When she sat down to dinner at the round table spread with a 3-day-old cloth, facing her husband, who always lifted the lid of the soup tureen and declared delightedly, "Ah, stew, splendid! There's nothing I like better than a nice stew," she dreamed of elegant dinners, gleaming silverware, and tapestries which peopled the walls with mystical characters and strange birds in enchanted forests. She dreamed of exquisite dishes served on fabulous china plates, of pretty compliments whispered into willing ears and received with sphinx-like smiles over the pink flesh of a trout or the wings of a hazel hen. So once again, it shows how ungrateful she is, and shows a lack of knowledge. The list once again show her sort of fanciful view of manor living, and it's all to do with materialism, and it's all to do with aesthetics and appearance. It's very vain. She takes great disgust, even though it's not said, we can get this implicitly. She takes great disgust at the fact that she's got a 3-day-old cloth on her table, which is just like, it's just really vain. It's really like shallow to be like, oh, there's a 3-day-old cloth on my table. It's like, you're lucky to have a cloth at all, because in a working class household they wouldn't even be able to afford cloth. And they have food, which is like, especially in the Victorian era, food and poverty, there was such a disgusting gap between the working class and the upper classes. Even though she's middle class, the fact that they can have stew, a really nutritious, healthy meal, it's not enough for her. But it's interesting because once again it shows a lack of knowledge, because the fact that she's smiling over the pink flesh of a trout or the wings of a hazel hen, that food would have been accessed by middle class families, and like, I doubt trout or chicken would be a hard food to gain, whereas the upper class aristocratic families would have put on like 7-course dinners, and they would have mock turtle soup, and they would have all of the, like, they would have a plethora of plates. They would have exotic foods. They would have exotic fruit, like pineapple was like incredibly expensive back then, and the fact that she can only envision like over the pink flesh of a trout or the wings of a hazel hen, it shows how uncultured she is. It sort of highlights her lack of knowledge. Like she thinks that is what the upper class people are eating, and it's like, no, no, they're not having that. So it's sort of showing that she's out of her depth, and she believes she knows what she wants, but she's not painting an accurate picture of what her life would be like. She had no fine dresses, no jewellery, nothing, and that was all she cared about. She felt that God had made her for such things. She would have given anything to be popular, envied, attractive, and in demand. So the repetition of no once again shows she's really unhappy. And the rule or list of three, like there's a lot of lists that you'd probably want to know in your if this text came up, because the lists give you a lot of information. It shows her lack of material wealth, and this is a sore point for her, and it's very direct, especially when she's like, she felt that God had made her for such things. So she's even like believing that God has almost given her this divine right to be born into an upper class society, and it's like, no, clearly God doesn't believe that, because otherwise he would have put you there. But she's even like, oh no, God intended me to be made for these things, and it's like, no. So paragraph 5. She had a friend who was rich, a friend from her convent days, on whom she never called now, for she was always so happy afterwards. Sometimes for days on end she would weep tears of sorrow, regret, despair, and anguish. This sort of, paragraph 6. This shows, like, convent is obviously where nuns live, and nuns would be celibate, and back then troubled young women were sent to escape or hide from scandals, so potentially this could almost like allude to a secret past. It throws a lot of interesting questions about exactly what kind of life has Madame Louise actually lived before she married. It's really interesting. You might want to do some more research into that, because I'm not 100% sure, but I know previous to this, convent living was kind of where troubled young women were hidden. Like, for example, if they had a baby out of wedlock, the baby would be taken away and they would be sent off to a convent to hide, to avoid scandal. But if she's only living in middle class society, the middle classes didn't really have scandals. They'd be in on the gossip, but it was more so the upper classes that were negatively impacted by scandals. Okay, so I've got 7 to 10 now. So one evening her husband came home looking highly pleased with himself. In his hand he brandished a large envelope. "Look," he said, "I've got something for you." She tore the paper flap eagerly and extracted a printed card bearing these words: "The Minister of Education and Madame Georges Ramponneau request the pleasure of the company of Monsieur and Madame Louisel at the Ministry buildings on the evening of 18th of January. Instead of being delighted as her husband hoped, she tossed the invitation peevishly onto the table, muttered, "What earthly use is that to me?" So she's been invited to a party, but it's not a grand party. Once again, she believes this is below her, and her actions show her bitter disappointment and frustration, because she just tosses this envelope, this invite, back onto the table, and her scathing comment implies it will not better her position in society. The way she mentions earthly, so this idea that her present earthly life is not as she envisions it, and she sort of takes great offence at that. And I mean, her lovely husband has he's only a clerk, so the fact that he's even been able to gain an invitation is a big deal, but she doesn't care. She just throws it back in his face, and I feel really sorry for him. So, "But darling, I thought you'd be happy. You never go anywhere, and it's an opportunity, a splendid opportunity. I had the dickens of a job getting hold of an invite. Everybody's after them. They're very much in demand, and not many are handed out to us clerks. You'll be able to see all the big knobs there." So obviously, big knobs was like a colloquial term for like the social elite, the bigwigs, the like upper class people. And he's very optimistic. The husband's very optimistic, and he did this on her behalf. And I mean, if he offended his boss by like overstepping his boundary, like a clerk going up and being like, "Can we have an invite to this party?" he could have potentially lost his job. So the fact that he's sacrificed or risked so much for her, and yet she's just being really horrible about it, just sort of shows really highlights their character and how he's a good, decent man. And then we're on to the next bit. And also his dialogue is very interesting because compared to the way she's being very formal, like, what earthly use is that to me? He's using colloquial terms like the Dickens. Like, I doubt the upper class society members would have used words such as Dickens, and like the way he speaks is sort of it's kind of like a mix between it's a mix between sort of middle class and almost working class society. Like the syntax of, and not many are handed out to us clerks. You could just say, and not many are handed out to clerks, but he says us clerks, so it's a bit more rough around the edges. She looked at him irritably and said shortly, "And what am I supposed to wear if I do go?" He had not thought of that. He blustered. "What about the dress for the theatre? It looks all right to me." The words died in his throat. He was totally disconcerted and dismayed by the sight of his wife, who had begun to cry. 2 large tears rolled slowly out of the corners of her eyes and down towards the sides of her mouth. "What's up?" he stammered. "What's the matter?" So, once again, it shows how she's very selfish and obsessed with vanity. Oh, sorry, I've got to read a bit more. So, making a supreme effort, she controlled her sorrows and, wiping her damp cheeks, replied quite calmly, "Nothing. It's just that I haven't got anything to wear, and consequently I shan't be going to any reception. Give the invite to one of your colleagues with a wife who is better off for clothes than I am," which obviously is showing she's very selfish. She's obsessed with vanity. She's obsessed with her, which means she's obsessed with her appearance. He was devastated. He went on, "Oh, come on, Matilda. Look, what could it cost to get something suitable that would do for other occasions, something fairly simple?" So he's seeking a compromise. It shows his compassion. It shows he's frugal with his finances. And it implies education highlights difference of class. I might need to read on. So she thought for a few moments, working out her sums. Oh, here we go. She thought for a few moments, working out her sums, but also wondering how much she could decently ask for without drawing an immediate refusal and pained protest from her husband, who was careful with his money. Finally, after some hesitation, she said, "I can't say precisely, but I dare say I could get by on 400 francs. So it implies that this woman also does have a sense of education, and that once again highlights the difference of class, because upper class women would have been concerned with the musical education and reading, potentially writing for letter writing, but it would be very much more genteel. The fact that she's able to do maths is kind of like upper class women wouldn't have been able to do maths necessarily. Some of them might have been able to if they were in a more open-minded family, but it wasn't really, those were much more male dominated subjects, and they weren't really expected to be taught to women, because in the Victorian era we have this whole image of a woman is she's meant to be the angel of the home, although once again this is more so coming from a British view on what a Victorian woman was. But it's kind of this idea that permeated throughout Europe as well, as like the accomplished lady. So an upper class lady is meant to be able to play musical instruments, she's meant to be a hostess, she's meant to entertain and charm and be very accommodating to people. The fact that Madame Louiselle, is able to do maths and sums, is kind of once again shows that she doesn't belong in that world. And then let's have a look. So he turned slightly pale, for he had been setting aside just that amount to buy gun and finance hunting trips the following summer in the flat landscape around Nanterre, with a few friends who went shooting larks there on Sundays. But he said, "Very well, I'll give you your 400 francs, but do try and get a decent dress." So I love this person, is lovely. He's sacrificing his own pursuits for the sake of his wife, and she is just so ungrateful. She really annoys me, this character. So the day of the reception drew near, and Madame Louiselle appeared sad, worried, anxious. Yet all her clothes were ready. One evening her husband said, "What's up? You haven't half been acting funny these last few days." So once again, he's concerned about her well-being, which back then is a massive thing. because women were often deemed to be hysterical and were often thrown in asylums very easily if they displayed too much emotion. The fact that he cares about her well-being screams volumes, especially when marriages weren't made for love, they were made for business transactions. People would psychologically, from a psychological point of view, as we understand psychology today, a lot of people would not have been well matched. She replied, "It vexes me that I haven't got a single piece of jewellery, not one stone that I can put on. I'll look like a church mouse. I'd almost as soon not go to the reception." So she's dishumanising herself by comparing to herself like a church mouse. And once again, it's just highlighting her selfishness and the way she, like, very hyperbolic, like, not one stone she can put on. It's like, he's giving you money for a dress, just be grateful for that. She's just and then he's like, "Wear a posy," which is obviously a flower. "Wear a posy," he said. "It's all the rage this year. You could get 2 or 3 magnificent roses for 10 francs. And once again, he's seeking a compromise and he's trying to show an awareness of fashion, but I doubt that the upper class members would have worn posies. That would probably be deemed a vulgar thing because they would have jewels and like gems and real diamonds and everything. And then he goes on to work out a solution to go to the wealthy friend to loan a piece of jewellery, and once again it shows how vain she is, but I'll read that bit to you now. She was not convinced. "No, there's nothing so humiliating as to look poor when you're with women who are rich." But her husband exclaimed, "You aren't half silly. Look, go and see your friend, Madame Forrester, and ask her to lend you some jewellery. You know her well enough for that." She gave a delighted cry. "You're right, I never thought of that." So it's like she's grateful that he's come up with a solution, but she hasn't even thanked him for the money, and she didn't even thank him earlier on for the money he gave her. It's like she's just so vain. The next day she called on her friend and told her all about her problem. It's like a very, like, especially during this era where there's such poverty and children die in infancy because they're malnourished and they haven't got enough food to eat. It's quite disgusting that she's so concerned about her appearance. It's a real social issue, and you could definitely, if you understand the historical context of the Victorian era, you can understand why her behaviour is so unacceptable. And like further on in the actual anthology booklet, it sort of says you can take like a more well-rounded view and you could like sort of empathise with her, but I find that really difficult to do with the historical context of the Victorian era. I'm like, no, I feel no sympathy for her. She brings this upon herself. But don't worry, she does have her downfall, and it's quite good. It serves her right, basically, what happens in the story. So Madame Forrester went over to a mirror-fronted wardrobe, took out a large casket, brought it over, unlocked it, and said to Madame Louisa, "Choose whatever you like." So it shows that she doesn't have an emotional attachment to her jewellery because she's willingly let her friend have whatever she wants. Just got to delete that one. Okay. At first she saw brackets, then a rope of pearls and a Venetian cross made of gold and diamonds, admirably fashioned. She tried on the necklaces in the mirror and could hardly bear to take them off and give them back. So once again, see, we've got this emotional connection to jewellery, which is very vain. She's definitely emotionally damaged in some way if she's getting so much attachment to a piece of jewellery rather than to her own husband. It's quite disturbing. There's something not quite right about this, and it just sort of shows how shallow her character is. She kept asking, "Have you got anything else?" "Yes, of course, just look. I can't say what sort of thing you'll like best." So, yeah, the friend's not precious about her jewellery, and attachment, more emotion than she feels for her husband. The friend's being accommodating, and she agrees, and she's more intimate with her friend, or more intimate in friendship, but once again, this is all materially based. Oh, that's right. So, all of a sudden, in a black stainwood case, she found a magnificent diamond necklace, and her heart began to beat with immoderate desire. Her hands, so once again, we see this really emotional connection, and a moderate desire sort of shows it's almost going into like this kind of sense of lust, which is a big sin. Her hands shook as she picked it up. She fastened it around her throat over her high neck dress and sat looking at herself in rapture. So once again, it's this very narcissistic element to her as well, like she's admiring her own reflection. Then diffidently, apprehensively, she asked, Can you lend me this? Nothing else, just this. But of course. She threw her arms around her friend, kissed her extravagantly, and then ran home, taking her treasure with her. So once again, she's more intimate with her friend, although this probably is friendship. It's very materially based. But she's more intimate with her friend for giving her, loaning her this jewellery than she is with her own husband, which seems very unbalanced. Okay. The day of the reception arrived, Madame Louisa was a success. We've gone into short, snappy sentences, and everything is wonderful now. She was the prettiest woman there, elegant, graceful, radiant, and wonderfully happy. All the men looked at her, inquired who she was, and asked to be introduced. All the cabinet secretaries and under-secretaries wanted to waltz with her. She was even noticed by the minister himself. And this is the other thing, though, which shows how illogical this character is, because she's being noticed by all these people, but she's married. So even if someone did show an interest in her, unless she was going to risk her reputation and divorce her husband, which back then was a huge no-no, it wasn't something you would do or get away with lightly, and it would always be the woman's fault. But the fact that she is being noticed by these people, what does she think she's going to be able to do? Is she just going to throw away her husband and then be like, oh yes, I'll marry you? No, they're probably just in that moment in the party atmosphere admiring her. It sort of is a very false perception or false belief that she can easily ascend to the upper social classes. It's not as simple as that. And even if she did do that, the scandal and the ridicule she'd be met with would ostracise her from those upper class circles if she did divorce her husband, and she'd be the subject of gossip and ridicule, and she wouldn't get anywhere because she wouldn't have any friends or social calls to make, and no one would want to social call on her because she's come from this middle class background. And if she divorced her husband, she'd have all the wealth if she did marry a husband successfully, but once again she'd be trapped, and then she wouldn't be happy because she'd have no one to share it with. So she's just very idealistic and not really understanding the situation. So she danced ecstatically, wildly, intoxicated with pleasure, giving no thought to anything else, swept along on her victorious beauty and glorious success, and floating on a cloud of happiness composed of the admiration is just respect, admiration and desire she evoked, and the kind of complete and utter triumph which is so sweet to a woman's heart. So she's come alive at this party, and once again that just highlights how shallow she is. She could be content most of the time, but she chooses not to be. And then she left at about 4 a.m. Since midnight, her husband had been dozing in a small, empty side room with 3 other men whose wives were having an enjoyable time. He helped her on with her coat, which he had fetched when it was time to go, a modest, everyday coat, a commonplace coat violently at odds with the elegance of her dress. It brought her down to earth, and she would have preferred to slip away quietly and avoided being noticed by the other women who were being arrayed in rich furs, but Louisa grabbed her by the arm. "Wait a sec, you'll catch cold outside. I'll go and get a cab." So this is very similar to Cinderella. It's like a reversal Cinderella scene where when the clock strikes midnight, Cinderella obviously she reforms back to her peasant clothes, and the spell's been broken by her caring husband, but she refused to listen and ran quickly down the stairs. When they were outside in the street, there was no cab in sight. They began looking for one, hailing all the cabbies they saw driving by in the distance. They walked down to the Seine in desperation, shivering with cold. There on the embankment they at last found one of those aged nocturnal hackney cabs which only emerge in Paris after dusk, as if ashamed to parade their poverty in the full light of day. It bore them back to their front door in the Rue de Martez, and they walked sadly up to their apartment. For her it was all over, while he was thinking that he would have to be at the ministry at 10. So it's a very bleak setting change from the grandeur, the excitement of the party. The mood has gone completely down again structurally. It's a really interesting structure point to make. The spell's been broken. She's back to reality. Her husband is thinking about reality. But things are going to get a whole lot worse. So, standing in front of the mirror, she took off the coat she had been wearing over her shoulders to get a last look at herself in all her glory. Suddenly she gave a cry. The necklace was no longer round her throat. Her husband, who was already half undressed, asked, "What's up?" She turned to him in a panic. Madame Forrester's necklace. I haven't got it." He straightened up as if thunderstruck. "What? But you can't have lost it." They looked in the pleats of her dress, in the folds of her coat, and in her pockets. They looked everywhere. They did not find it. And that's quite interesting because she almost has this kind of idea that clothes are her protection from her social status, and now this has been a role reversal where they're searching her for this necklace that she's lost. So now the clothes have gone from being a symbol of like protection and trying to better herself to something that's going to be her downfall. So it's quite symbolic. You can comment on the symbolic nature of clothes and stuff, and it's really interesting actually when you sort of study clothes and fashion in the Victorian era, because anything can be a symbol, and clothes are definitely a symbol in this. Are you sure you still had it when you left the ballroom? He asked. Yes, I remember fingering it in the entrance, and once again, you could perceive this as like, that's a very intimate verb to use, the idea of fingering. She's fingering a necklace, and that's showing that intimate attachment to something that's material, which is really interesting when you think about it. It's like less than human. It's like she's very concerned about her appearance. She shows much more attention to material objects than to obviously her husband, and it's just very disconnected. She's emotionally disconnected from her life. But if you'd lost it in the street, we'd have heard it fall, so it must be in the cab. That's right, that's probably it. Did you get his number? No. Did you happen to notice it? No. They looked at each other in dismay. Finally, Louiselle got dressed again. I'm going to go back the way we came, he said, to see if I can find it. He went out. She remained as she was, still wearing her evening gown, not having the strength to go to bed, sitting disconsolately on a chair by the empty grate. So once again, the setting has become very bleak. There's no fire in the grate, and her mind a blank, and everything is just going wrong. Her husband returned at about 7 o'clock. He had found nothing. So once again, the short, snappy sentences to show that loss of hope, they're trapped. They're screwed, basically. He went to the police station, called at newspaper offices where he advertised a reward, toured the cab companies, and tried anywhere where the faintest of hopes led him. She waited for him all day long in the same distracted condition, thinking of the appalling catastrophe which had befallen them. Louiselle came back that evening, hollow-cheeked and very pale. He had not come up with anything. Look, he said, you'll have to write to your friend and say you broke the catch on her necklace and you're getting it repaired. That'll give us time to work out what we'll have to do. So once again, he's come up with a creative, brilliant solution. Unfortunately, she's not going to go for this. She wrote to his dictation. A week later, they had lost all hope. Louiselle, who had aged 5 years, said, we'll have to start thinking about replacing the necklace. The next day, they took the case in which it had come and called on the jeweller whose name was inside. He looked through his order book. It wasn't me that sold the actual necklace. I only supplied the case. After this, they trailed round the jeweller's shop, looking for a necklace just like the other one, trying to remember it, and both ill with worry and anxiety. In a shop in the Palais Royal, they found a diamond collar, which they thought was identical to the one they were looking for. It cost 40,000 francs. The jeweller was prepared to let them have it for 36. So this is a very drastic measure they're about to take. Rather than just using honesty and common sense to go and admit, I lost your necklace, they're going to make the drastic decision to buy this. They asked him not to sell it for 3 days, and they got him to agree to take it back for 34,000 if the one that had been lost turned up before the end of February. Louiselle had 18,000 francs which his father had left him. He would have to borrow the rest. He borrowed the money, and this is where the husband kind of makes a mistake because he's not thinking logically, and he's ended up borrowing all this money, and basically they're going to get into massive debt. He borrowed the money, 1,000 francs here, 500 there, sometimes 100 and as little as 60. He signed notes, agreed to pay exorbitant rates of interest, resorted to usurers, which are like basically dodgy money lenders. They get money through probably illegal means, and they're really dangerous people to be in debt to. And the whole tribe of money lenders, so basically people who either get money through gambling and betting or other illicit, dodgy, illegal ways of getting money, and he's now in debt to them. He mortgaged the rest of his life, which I think is a beautiful metaphor. A very tragic, poignant metaphor, but I think it's a beautiful metaphor. The fact he mortgaged the rest of his life, signed papers without knowing if he would ever be able to honour his commitments, and then sick with worry about the future, the grim poverty which stood ready to pounce, and the prospect of all the physical privation and mental torture ahead, he went round to the jeweller's to get the new necklace with the 36,000 francs which he put on the counter. When Madame Liesel took it round, Madame Forrester said in a huff, "You ought really to have brought it back sooner. I might have needed it." She did not open the case as her friend had feared she might. If she had noticed the substitution? What would she have thought? What would she have said? Would she not have concluded she was a thief? So once again, the wife isn't even grateful to her husband for the sacrifice he has made. She is more concerned about how her friend would have perceived her if she opened the box to discover that the necklace isn't the same, or isn't perfect, or noticed that it was a switch. Then began for Madame Louisel the grindingly horrific life of the very poor. So this is very much just desserts, it's very much karma coming into real life. But quickly and heroically, she resigned herself to what she could not alter. Their appalling debt would have to be repaid. She was determined to pay. They dismissed the maid. They moved out of their apartment and rented an attic room. So it's the fact that through all her complaining structurally in the beginning of the story, now that she is forced into poverty by her own design, she is now accepting her circumstances, which are worse than how she was. So it really shows how being ungrateful and wishing for more is not necessarily, it's like a life lesson. It's not a good thing. You should be grateful for what you have, and it's not a bad thing to want to better yourself, but when you go to such extremes to do it, it's like that kind of moral lesson of, like, you know, don't necessarily wish for more, or I can't remember the actual phrase, but there's a phrase like, it's like that kind of thing. That's it. Be careful what you wish for. That's basically this. She became used to heavy domestic work and all kinds of ghastly kitchen chores. She washed dishes, wearing down her pink nails on the greasy pots and saucepan. She washed the dirty sheets, shirts, and floor cloths by hand and hung them up to dry on a line. Each morning she took the rubbish down to the street and carried the water up, pausing for breath on each landing, and dressed like any working class woman. She shopped at the fruiterers, the grocers, and the butchers with a basket over her arm, haggling frequently, abused, and always counting every penny. So she's completely changed her ways, and the lists, structurally, the lists have changed. They're now focused on poverty rather than her daydreaming about wealth. So that's an interesting note to change. Or change to note, sorry. My words getting mixed up. Each month they had to settle some accounts, renew others, and bargain for time. So once again, they're still in this horrible cycle of debt. Her husband worked in the evenings doing accounts for a shopkeeper, and quite frequently sat up into the early hours doing copying work at 5 sous a page. And sous is a very little amount of French currency, so he's not getting much. They lived like this for 10 years. By the time 10 years had gone by, they had repaid everything, which is quite a noble thing, actually, that they managed to achieve this, with not a penny outstanding, in spite of the extortionate conditions, and including the accumulated interest, which kind of also suggests that if the wife had been more accommodating, they potentially could have worked their way up. But this is just to pay off their debt. They've sort of financially ruined themselves for a very long time. So Madame Louisel looked old now. She had turned into the battling, hard, uncouth housewife who rules working-class homes. So she's become what she feared most, basically. Her hair was untidy, her skirts were askew, and her hands were red. So that's obviously red and raw from all the washing she's done. She spoke in a gruff voice and scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. And once again, that's very much showing the difference between her and the life she dreamt of, because upper class women would have very soft hands because they wouldn't have to do any of their own washing. They wouldn't even have to dress themselves. They wouldn't have to cook. They wouldn't have to clean. So it was always a tactile thing that you would know a lady by her hands, because they would be soft, because they never would have been used for work, whereas most of us have rough hands because we work and do things. So she spoke in a gruff voice and scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. So it's quite interesting how she's physically become what she fears most. Not just she lacked the aesthetic look of the life she wanted in the beginning, but now she has physically become further away from that. She's actually physically now not ever going to be able to be perceived as someone of the upper classes. But sometimes, when her husband had gone to the office, she would sit by the window and think of that evening long ago when she'd been so beautiful and so admired. So she still thinks about that time, even though she's never going to be able to live that life now. She's lost her chance. What might not have happened had she not lost the necklace? Who could tell? Who could possibly tell? Life is so strange, so fickle. How little is needed to make or break us. So it's like the rhetorical question. She's like mentally torturing herself over what would have happened, what would her life have been like. One Sunday, needing a break from her heavy working week, she went out for a stroll on the Champs-Élysées. Suddenly she caught sight of a woman pausing a child in a pram. It was Madame Forrester. She's still young, still beautiful, and still attractive. Madame Louise felt apprehensive. Should she speak to her? Yes, why not? Now that she had paid in full, she would tell her everything. Why not? She went up to her. Hello, Jean. The friend did not recognise her and was taken aback at being addressed so familiar by a common woman in the street. She stammered, "But I'm sorry, I don't know. There's some mistake." "No mistake. I'm Madame Louise." Her friend gave a cry. "But my poor Matilda, how you've changed." "Yes, I've been through some hard times since I saw you, very hard times, and it was all on your account." I love how she's doing diffusion of responsibility here. "On my account? Whatever do you mean? Do you remember the diamond necklace you lent me to go to the reception at the ministry?" "Yes, what about it?" "Well, I lost it." "Lost it? But you returned it to me." "No, I returned another one just like it, and we've been paying for it these past 10 years. You know it wasn't easy for us. We had nothing. But it's over and done with now, and I'm glad." So she might actually have a sense of satisfaction at working for something, but it's hard to tell with this character because she is very shallow. Madame Forrester stopped. "You mean you bought a diamond necklace to replace mine?" "Yes, and you never noticed the difference, did you? They were exactly alike," and she smiled a proud, innocent smile. I love this. This is the best twist that ever happens in this short story. Madame Forrester looked very upset and, taking both her hands in hers, said, "Oh, my poor Matilda. But it was only an imitation necklace. It couldn't have been worth more than 500 francs. So they basically brought about their own downfall, because what Madame Louise fails to understand about the upper classes is that even those who are in positions of wealth may have had imitation necklace, and she assumed just on appearance alone that her friend was wealthy, but actually her friend wasn't necessarily wealthy. Her friend was probably middle class like her, but she had imitation necklaces that she could afford. But because Madame Louisa was obsessed with appearance, she thought, oh, she must have the real thing. She must have like an actual diamond necklace made from real diamonds. So they brought about their own ruin, and it's really interesting how the husband goes along with that ruin as well, probably out of love. But it's just a really interesting short story, and it reminds me of this one of Shakespeare's quote. I think it's from The Merchant of Venice. I don't know, because that's one of the plays I've not read of Shakespeare before, but Shakespeare has a brilliant quote in one of his plays, and it's "all that glitters is not gold," and that is basically what this short story is reminiscent of. It's that idea that just because something looks a particular way doesn't mean you should take that at face value, because if you do, you get into very dodgy situations such as that. So I hope this video helps. Any questions, as always, please feel free to comment below, and I hope to make another video soon. Bye.